My name is Brenna Tanner. I'm from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. And today I'd like to share about my ongoing research that I've entitled in today's presentation as Mapping the Translators of the Meiji Bible. So this project revisits one of the most influential yet understudied translation efforts in modern Japanese history, the translation of the Bible during the Meiji era, and more specifically, the 1880 Japanese authorized version of the New Testament translation. So while many scholars have examined the linguistic and theological impact of this translation, we still know surprisingly little about the people who made it possible, the translators themselves, both the missionaries and the Japanese translators. My aim is to bring these individuals back into the focus and to show how their collaboration reshaped not only Japanese Christianity, but also the Japanese language itself. So the Meiji Bible is not only a cultural and linguistic project, it's a transformative. And so this means that the Meiji Bible is more than a religious text. It was a nation-shaping enterprise. At the time, Japan was undergoing radical transformation, modernizing its institutions, rewriting its legal and education systems, and redefining its relationship to language and print culture. Translating the Bible in this moment meant negotiating between languages, ideologies, and authorities. It was a cross-cultural project that involved English, Greek, Hebrew, and Chinese sources, as well as the developing norms of modern Japanese. In short, the Meiji Bible was a linguistic experiment carried out under intense political scrutiny, and it became one of the earliest texts to model modern prose, stable grammar, and even gender-neutral narrative voice. On the next slide, I'd like to talk briefly about the research framework and methodology as attempted so far. So this research draws on the field of literary translator studies, particularly Michaela Kindle's argument that translators are not invisible mediators, but active cultural agents. To explore that agency, I applied digital humanities tools such as prosopography or collective biography to map connections among translators, institutions, and publications. This approach allows the shift from reading the Bible as a text to understanding Bible translation as a social practice. The archives I work with include missionary correspondence, church records, and digitized resources from the Meiji Gakuin Digital Archive, as well as rare Bible editions once used by the translators themselves, now preserved at the Tokyo Union Theological Seminary Library. So on the left here is a page from the New Testament of Matthew from 1880, from the official, more or less, translation. And then on the right is an earlier attempt by a missionary named James Curtis Hepburn and Nathan Brown, Samuel R. Brown, that they did in 1875 before the official publication here on the left. So when we look at the history of Bible translation in Japan, it's easy to focus on the final text, this one here on the left. The elegant Meiji version published in 1880 for the New Testament and 87 for the Old Testament. But this translation was the result of 15 years of intense cross-cultural collaboration. It began in September 1872 when a group of Protestant missionaries gathered at the home of James Curtis Hepburn in Yokohama. You might know this name from such as the Hepburn English to Japanese, Japanese to English first dictionary, or the Hepburn Romaji system that was popularized through this dictionary. So these representatives from 7 denominations, including the Dutch Reformed, the Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist Episcopal, and Anglican Church Missionary Society, decided to cooperate on a single ecumenical Japanese New Testament. They formed what became known as the Bible Translation Committee, Shinyakusei Shohonyakuin Shachu. The committee's chair was Samuel Robbins Brown, with members James Curtis Hepburn, Daniel Crosby Green, Nathan Brown, Robert Samuel McClay, Samuel Johnson Piper, and George Enzer Wright. And they were joined by 4 Japanese assistants, Okuno Masatsuna, Matsuyama Takayoshi, Takahashi Goro, and Ibuka Kajinosuke, whose linguistic insight was essential to shaping the Japanese text. These men worked side by side in daily morning sessions, often spending hours revising a single verse. Between 1876 and 1880, the New Testament was gradually published, with the complete edition released in 1880. The translators experimented with different orthographies, kanji, kana mixed text, hiragana editions, and even katakana versions, to determine which written form could best express sacred language in a nation whose modern written style was still taking shape. The result was a hybrid style that balanced clarity with reverence, helping to define the prose of modern Japanese literature. It was at once accessible and dignified, a linguistic compromise reflecting both missionary intent and Japanese literary sensibility. Soon after the New Testament was published, the Old Testament translation began. In October 1876, Protestant representatives met again in Tsukiji, Tokyo, and agreed to continue the work. This effort was first managed by Tokyo Bible Translation Committee, which later evolved into the Permanent Committee on the Translation, Revision, and Publication of the Holy Scriptures. Missionaries such as George Cochrane, who was a Canadian Methodist, Henry Loomis Thomason, Presbyterian Mission, and William George Waddell, United Presbyterian Church of Scotland, contributed alongside James Curtis Hepburn. Japanese collaborators included Okuno Masatsuna, Uemura Masahisa, Ozaki Hiromichi, and Odagiri Motoichiro. And they joined later, refining language and tone. By 1887, after multiple reorganizations, the translation of the entire Old Testament was complete. Its poetic sections, especially the Psalms, Book of Isaiah, and Song of Songs, were celebrated for their literary quality and deeply influenced Meiji period writing. Taken together, the 1872 through 1887 translation projects were not only religious undertakings, but linguistic nation building. They defined how Japanese could express faith, emotion, and moral abstraction. Through this process, translation became a creative act, a collaboration across language, culture, and belief that helped construct the foundations of modern Japanese expression. Here's the Japanese members added from 1883 onward. So, next, I'd like to talk about, highlight that this translation happened under constraint. So Bible translation in Meiji Japan took place under conditions of censorship and persecution. Christianity had been outlawed for over 2 centuries, but foreigners that came on Japanese soil were allowed to continue practicing their own religion under the agreement that they would not proselytize to the Japanese people. And so early Protestant missionaries like James Curtis Hepburn and Samuel Robbins Brown worked under surveillance, and this is evident from their letters. So something like printing the Bible, a key tool for proselytizing domestically in Japan, was illegal. So the translators resorted to a remarkable workaround. They carved wooden printing blocks in Japan, and then they shipped them to Shanghai, and they printed the text under extraterritorial protection and then smuggled the Bibles back into Yokohama. This meant that the act of translation was also an act of legal defiance and transnational collaboration. The translators were not simply producing a religious text, they were navigating empire, censorship, and theology simultaneously. That brings me to my primary case study in my current research. So this case study that captures the human complexity behind this project is the Translation Committee for the Japanese New Testament, active in the 1870s. Also coined on this slide as the Meiji Translation Committee. The committee consisted of the 3 foreign missionaries, Samuel Brown, James Hepburn, and Daniel Green, as well as their Japanese assistants. These Japanese assistants were often Japanese who had learned English or were considered capable with language, such as former doctors, and they became the missionaries' personal language tutors while they were in Japan, and they were assigned by the government. All of these men met almost daily at Brown's Yokohama residence from 9 in the morning until noon. According to later recollections, some sessions produced only one revised verse in 3 hours. These painstaking meetings involved side-by-side comparison of the Greek Textus Receptus, the King James Version, and the Chinese Bridgman Culbertson Bible, alongside Japanese grammar manuals and dictionaries. The group was divided on how scripture should sound. Missionaries favored a simple classical Japanese, believing it would reach educated readers and maintain dignity. The Japanese translator, however, preferred a Sino-Japanese style, closer to Kanbun and influenced by the Chinese Bibles already in circulation. This debate over register and syntax shaped the hybrid style of the 1880 Japanese Authorized Version, a text that balanced readability with solemnity. It became a linguistic model for later prose writing and an unintentional prototype for Genbun Ichi style reform. The committee also struggled with theological terminology. For example, how should God be rendered? Should it be kami, or should it be something like tenshu, or something like in the Chinese Bible, like shangdi? Ultimately, kami was chosen, drawing on Shinto familiarity while reframing the word within a monotheistic framework. Other terms required invention, such as baptisme for baptism. This was translated to avoid sectarian dispute over sprinkling versus immersion, which I'll talk a little bit about on the next slide. Squi for salvation, adapted from the polite verb sku, to save, as well as shinko for faith, a neologism that entered mainstream vocabulary through the Meiji Bible. Each of these choices was a site of ideological negotiation, reflecting both linguistic creativity and theological compromise. The committee structure also revealed clear hierarchies. Missionaries held final editorial control, but the Japanese translators shaped tone, diction, and readability. Their names, however, were often omitted from published editions, a reminder of how collective translation was publicly framed as missionary achievement. Reintroducing these Japanese assistants into the narrative challenges the assumption of Western authorship and highlights translation as a co-authored cultural labor. Just to highlight the importance of the study through this example is, I mentioned earlier, there's James Curtis Hepburn and the Committee of Translators. And so one of those members was Nathan Brown. And there's, through letters and archival research, it's been recognized that Nathan Brown, a capable translator in his own right, was in a disagreement with the rest of the translation committee over the term of baptism. Because without the context that Nathan Brown was a Baptist compared to the other translators on the committee who were other various branches of Christianity, Brown insisted that something like the way that baptism should be written in this Bible was very important, and important enough that he left the committee and acquired his own printing press and printed his own hiragana version of the New Testament, as you can see here on the left photo. And this is an excerpt from Acts. And then here's the same version of Acts, the same span of verses of Acts on the right of the Meiji translation by the committee. And as you can see, that they were published only a year apart in 1879 and 1880. And so in Nathan Brown's translation, he relied on shizumeru, the idea of submerging, and then on the Meiji translation, they opted to go for baptismu, which was the transliteration of baptism, because of this disagreement and the idea of how do we translate such an important ideology that would be easy to understand for the Japanese people. So to continue, the translations as linguistic construction. So the Meiji Bible did not merely translate words, it constructed a new linguistic reality, as we discussed a little bit earlier. And so because Japanese lacked consistent grammatical standards, translators had to stabilize syntax, develop abstract nouns, and balance gendered and hierarchical speech levels. Figures like Hepburn published dictionaries and grammar guides to support the translation process, and their linguistic forms fed back into education, journalism, and literary writing, establishing norms of punctuation, sentence order, and even paragraph structure. In this sense, Bible translation was a laboratory of language modernization. The same translators who debated theological nuance were, perhaps unknowingly, laying the groundwork for modern Japanese prose. When we visualize these translators as a network, missionaries, assistants, printers, and Bible societies, a rich web of collaboration emerges. Institutions such as Meiji Gakuin, Doshisha, and the American Bible Society provided funding, training, and publishing infrastructure during this time. So by using digital humanities such as prosopography, I map how people and text circulated among these institutions, showing that translation operated within intersecting systems of power, such as religious, educational, or imperial power. Translation was thus not only a linguistic act, but also an organizational one, mobilizing presses, donors, and believers across continents. So, in the terms of cultural and social impact, we have the influence of the Meiji Bible extended far beyond church walls. Its language became embedded in modern discourse, fiction, and education. Writers such as Uchimura Kanzo and later Dazai Osamu echoed biblical diction and imagery that first appeared in these translations. Nakai Junko estimates that by the 1890s, roughly 10% of Japan's population had read some portion of the Bible, a remarkable reach considering its semi-illegal status only decades earlier. The Bible thus functioned as both a spiritual and linguistic instrument of modernization, reshaping how Japanese readers encounter concepts such as sin, redemption, and individuality. So by reframing Bible translation through the lens of translator agency, we see the Meiji Bible not as a missionary import, but as a jointly authored cultural production. The translators, Japanese and foreign, negotiated meaning, grammar, and ideology under immense pressure. This collaborative authorship challenges the romantic ideal of the solitary translator and instead emphasizes translation as collective negotiation between empires and converts, between text and reader, and between spoken and written Japanese. Using digital humanities tools to reconstruct these biographies allows us to visualize how human labor, often invisible, made possible one of the most transformative texts in Japan's modern history. So, in conclusion, mapping the translators of the Meiji Bible reveals a story not just of linguistic ingenuity, but of courage, collaboration, and intellectual exchange. The 1880 translation was a meeting point of theology, politics, and language reform, forged through daily debate and quiet resistance. By recovering the translators' collective biographies, we gain a clearer view of how translation shaped Japan's encounter with modernity, how faith was translated into grammar, and how collaboration itself became a form of creation. Thank you guys very much for listening to my presentation, and that's all I have for you today.